Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. So I wanted to say, for me, reducing food waste really starts kind of before I get into the kitchen. And that really means tracking and planning. I try to be very purposeful and intentional with what food I'm bringing into the kitchen in the first place. So I do something called inventory tracking, where I kind of keep a note of what I already have in my kitchen, what things I don't have, and I also am pretty honest with myself. So if I know that I'm not going to eat a certain ingredient or I'm not going to finish it, I try to avoid buying it just to reduce that food waste in the first place. But I guess today what I really want to focus on are two strategies that I use a lot in the kitchen, and that is regrowing things from scraps, and reusing things or repurposing items that we may think of as food waste but can really give us additional life, before we really move on to getting rid of it. So again, if there's any questions in the chat room, please feel free to call them out. I'll be trying to monitor, but I probably won't get to all of them. So for me, I have a couple of items that I want to show that I tend to regrow. And the first one is ginger. So I feel like ginger for me is something that I buy a lot, but it's quite difficult to go through all of it, at least for me, just because you usually have to buy it in a really big amount or like a really big chunk. And sometimes I just don't use all of that. So actually, ginger can pretty easily be regrown. What I do here is I have a chunk here. I don't know if you all can see. Let me know if you can't. And it's about 3 to 4 inches tall and a few inches wide. Something like this I could actually plant and regrow. The thing about ginger is it grows really well in our climate in San Diego because it is pretty sunny all year round. We have a good amount of, it's a very temperate climate. The only thing that it needs is humidity, because it is a tropical plant, but it does grow pretty well in San Diego. The thing that I find with ginger is it usually takes a few months. So by the time that you plant it and the time that you're harvesting, it's going to be probably at least like 6 months. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If you have space for it, it's really great if you use it, especially because young ginger is pretty hard to find. The next thing I want to talk about is green onions. I feel like a lot of people probably already know this. Green onions are extremely easy to regrow. All you do is put them in water and they kind of start to grow again. If you want to retain the flavor, you would put it in soil. I tend to find that after a few cycles of regrowth, the green onions tend to kind of get really small in size, and that's when I would move ahead and compost them and start a new batch from the grocery store. I also have some herbs here that I wanted to show. These are all really, really easy to water propagate, which means that you basically just, so I have here some rosemary. For me, herbs is something that's really difficult to go through when I buy it at the grocery store. I have to buy a whole bunch, and there's usually, I'm feeding myself like 1 to 2 people. And for me, I really don't go through that amount. So I actually found that growing my own herbs is pretty useful for me, just because I can take what I need and I don't have to go to the grocery store and buy a whole big bunch that I may or may not get through. So most herbs are actually super easy to regrow. All you do is take off the last few leaves like this, leave some space where you are actually going to put this in water. And the same goes for mint. I have some mint here. So I'm just going to take off these leaves and then put this in water. And in a few weeks, it'll start to grow some roots and we can put it in the soil. And the same thing with basil. So the basil is pretty much the same. I will say, if you're doing mint, be super careful about where you plant it. If you have a garden, I would recommend that you don't plant it directly in the soil because mint grows like a weed. Once you put it down, it starts to kind of proliferate very quickly, and it's difficult to get rid of if you don't want it growing in certain spaces. So definitely want to keep in a container is a mint. One thing I want to say about rosemary too is if you are going to water propagate, make sure that the stem is green. A woody stem or a dark brown stem is not going to grow any roots. And then leafy greens. leafy greens like lettuce, bok choy, celery, those are all pretty easy to grow as water propagation. So basically what you do is you kind of just put the stem end. So the end that has the root, you put that in water and it'll usually start to regrow. The only thing to say about that is a lot of those plants, when you buy them from the grocery store, they've kind of already put all of their, I guess, strength or all of their resources into that plant that you're buying. So that head of lettuce, that's kind of already the end result of the plant. So you're probably not going to get a full lettuce plant from a root that you buy at the grocery store. You'll probably get like a few new leaves, a few baby leaves that you could throw into a salad if you want. But I wouldn't expect to get like a full crop of lettuce or other leafy greens that you buy from the grocery store. So here's an example. I have this Chinese spinach right here. And basically what I did was these are the stem ends from the pieces that me and my family didn't eat. So I just put these in water. This has been in here for about a week or so. You can see that I apologize for the camera quality because I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but there are some roots that are growing. They're fairly small. I could try to plant this, but really it's not going to give me like a full new plant. If you really want to grow your own leafy greens, I would recommend that you start from seed. But you can see that there are some small little leaves that are starting to sprout, and these I would really eat as like a microgreen salad or, you know, just like as a snack. And I see there are some questions in the chat, so I'm just quickly going to see that. Okay, Kim asks, for the ginger, would you put that in the entire piece of the ground or just a section of it? Kim, I want to say it really depends on how much you want to grow. So the thing with ginger is this root will continue to grow once you put it into the ground. So all of the fresh baby ginger is going to be growing from this original root right here. I would say that if you want to break it up into chunks, try to have 3 by 3 inches or so. Make sure that they have eyes like these, like you can see kind of these little brown spots right here. These are the eyes, and this is where new shoots will grow from. You could put the whole thing, like a whole big chunk of ginger in the ground if you wanted to. Just be mindful that it will grow pretty significantly, so you'll want to make sure that either you put it in the ground or you put it in a pot that has enough space to accommodate that. Or what you could do is once it starts to grow shoots up, you can kind of take it out of the soil and then break those shoots apart into individual plants, and then those will grow as their own plants. I usually just do chunks because I use ginger and I usually don't have a whole thing left over. I usually just use my leftover bits. So great question. Catherine asks, you eat the ginger shoots or just the root part? So for me, I usually just eat the root part, but the ginger part does have a lot of good flavor. The actual plant itself, like the leaves and all of those can be eaten. I personally haven't done that before, but I know that they are edible. They do have a lot of good flavor. A lot of people add them to stir fries. And that's just another way to kind of use the whole of the plant. And then the next thing that I do is repurpose. So things that I would think are not, things that a lot of people would kind of not think that have another purpose other than being trash, I actually find that you can use a lot of it. So right now I'm in Seattle in Washington, and I've been eating a lot of seafood just because the seafood up here is so good. And so things like, I have here a bag of shrimp shells from when me and my family had shrimp the other night, and lobster shells and all of that. All of that you could save. So even the shells you could save and you can make like a seafood stock, and then use that to enrich some sort of seafood stew or some sort of broth or soup or anything that you want to use it for. The same goes for chicken bones. Excuse me, sorry, chicken bones and carcasses and kind of like all the leftover pieces. I usually like to save those and make a homemade chicken stock with that. And then if you're vegetarian, I also do the same thing with beans. So I have here a can of chickpeas that I these are from dry, so I went ahead and soaked these and cooked them, and I store them in the broth that they, or the water that they get cooked in. And this makes a really, really good base for like a veggie broth, a soup broth. The same thing goes for black beans, for pinto beans, kidney beans. Depending also on how strong or like how much water you've used to cook chickpeas, you could also save that liquid and which is called an aquafaba, and use that to whip it up and make desserts with it. So like I know that I've made a vegan kind of like mousse, a chocolate mousse with that. You could also use aquafaba from a can. So if you're buying canned chickpeas, that liquid is usually pretty concentrated and whips up pretty well. I also have here some stale bread. So my family goes through bread pretty quickly, but we don't always go through all of it. And so for stale bread, I find that it is really good to add to soup. So if I'm making something like a revolata, which uses stale bread actually in the recipe, what you do is you make the soup. At the end, you put the stale bread on top and then you bake it, and it kind of crisps up and it adds this like additional texture that's really delicious. I also turn these into croutons, into breadcrumbs. So bread is definitely something that even after, I mean, as long as it's not moldy. If it's moldy, I would definitely not use that. Just because there's a lot of, if you can see the mold, then there's even more mold that is not visible. So I would get rid of it if it's moldy. But if it's stale, there's a lot of life still that this bread can give you. And then I wanted to talk about fruit scraps. So there's this one dish that I usually make in the summer. It's called tepache, and it's a Mexican it's kind of like a Mexican, very slightly alcoholic fermented pineapple drink. And the tepache, the way that you make it is, let's say you have a pineapple, you cut off all the skin, you're not going to use that skin, it's not edible. What I then do with that is I put it in water with some sugar and I kind of let it sit at room temperature. It ferments for like a day or two, and then I drink that. And it's really delicious. It's really refreshing in the summer. If you're comfortable with fermenting, that's definitely something I would try. Fermenting and pickling are probably some of the oldest ways to preserve food and to make food extend beyond the life that it would have if it was fresh. So definitely pickling food that is on its way out, that's something that I do. Fermenting things that are on its way out, that's something that I do as well. And if you're comfortable with that, it's definitely a great option. And then I would say, aside from what I've just shown you today, freezing items, a lot of items freeze super well. And so freezing items, if you're not really comfortable with pickling or fermenting or drying or dehydrating, freezing is probably the easiest and most accessible way that we can extend the life of our food. If I have a bag of spinach that I know I'm not going to get through before it wilts, I'll chuck that in the freezer, and then I'll just add the frozen spinach right to whatever I want to eat when I'm going to eat it. And also, oh, sorry, I wanted to show you, I have here a bin. This is my compost bin. So I recognize that not everybody can compost, or it's not feasible in everybody's home situation, but if you can compost, that is a really great way to get rid of, or to basically repurpose scraps. Anytime that I'm cooking and I'm working with vegetables, I will basically have my bin ready just on the counter with me. And I fill that up with food scraps as I'm cutting my things that I know I can't put into a broth or regrow or reuse. I'll just chuck it into the compost bin, and then I empty this out maybe like whenever it gets full. So 2 to 3 days, I'll empty it out. I have a lid for it, so it contains a lot of the smell. And you don't have to buy like fancy tabletop compost bins to start collecting food scraps. You could just use a Tupperware. That's literally what I'm doing. I just have this Tupperware with a lid, and I just throw all of my food scraps in here. So we have about 10 minutes for questions or comments, or if anybody has something that they do at home that I haven't covered. All of these things that I've covered are things that I personally do at home, so there may be some vegetables or some methods that I don't personally do. So yeah, we have about 10 minutes and then I think we'll move on to our discussion about the story of plastic. If you haven't, if you saw it and you want to stick around for the discussion of that. Let's see, Sharon says space saving for the freezer, blending spinach completely and then putting it in the ice cube tray for smoothies. That's a really, really great suggestion. I know that you could also do this with a lot of fresh herbs. A lot of people will freeze them in olive oil or butter and throw those into the freezer as well. I would say smoothies is a really great way to get rid of, or not get rid of, but use up some produce that's kind of on its way out. And so smoothies in general and then putting stuff in the freezer, I think are great options. Let's see, Jennifer says, how long does the composting usually take? What is my turnover for my composting bin? So it really depends on the method of composting that you're doing. I do hot composting, which means that I really pay attention to the different levels of items in there. So there are green items, like green waste, like garden clippings. Food waste is considered green waste. Brown items, which are cardboard, dry plant items that are no longer fresh. And so by managing the ratios of that, I make sure that my compost stays at a pretty high temperature. And I generally find that that turnaround is really quick, like a few weeks, I'll have fresh compost that I can use. But there are less active or less involved methods where you kind of just throw things in a compost bin and kind of let nature take its course because things are composting naturally. Something like that would probably take a little bit more time because you're not actively managing the ratio levels to try and keep that temperature up. So I would find that probably depending on how active you are, probably like 6 months for a turnaround time, or maybe even a year if your home is really dry. Compost needs water and it needs air to break down more efficiently. So if you water your compost or turn it frequently, that will increase the amount of basically decomposition that's happening, and it'll shorten the timeline for when you'll have compost that's ready to use. Is it okay to add fats to compost? I would say unless you have a very hot compost pile and you're really knowledgeable about kind of what the temperatures are in there, I would not add fats, animal products, dairy. I would not add that to the compost. Just because you're introducing another variable for rodents or animals who might be attracted to the compost pile. You also, if you're not sure that there's like a maximum temperature that it's getting to, you might not be sure that everything is composting as well as it can. The same thing goes for weeds. So if you have weeds and you're kind of doing your gardening and pulling those weeds out, I would not put the weeds into the compost unless you know for sure that your compost pile is getting above a certain temperature, because then what'll happen is you'll take out all of your new compost, you'll put it on your plants, and then you'll have weeds start to come up. Octavio says worm composting is less maintenance and faster turnover. Yes, I will say that. I personally haven't done worm composting just because I feel weird having ownership of a bunch of little creatures that I have to like, you know, keep alive. So personally, I haven't done worm composting, but it's a really, really great option if you don't have a lot of garden waste or green waste. Worm composting is super easy if all you really have is kitchen scraps. You don't have to worry about putting browns into your compost. You could just take your kitchen scraps, throw it to the worms, and then they'll eat it. And you'll have worm casings, which are a super nutrient-rich way to amend your garden soil. I usually freeze whole bags of pre-washed spinach greens without any processing. Yeah, I do that as well sometimes. Spinach and fresh greens are something that I just really like. I know I'm always going to use, and I just like to have a backup in the freezer. So depending on what I'm going to be making, I most likely will use frozen greens rather than fresh greens, just because I don't have to worry about using up a whole bag of spinach before it goes bad. All right, any other questions or comments?
How do you do the inventory? Do you
The
do it you by you
inventory.
do you use do you do it by using Siri or some automated thing so it can at least record it and then store it for you later?
So I do my inventory. I wish I had brought my journal down, but I have a journal where I kind of keep a lot of written notes about like things going on in my personal life that I want to keep track of. And part of that is an inventory track sheet. So basically what I have is I have little sticky notes where, and I reuse these sticky notes. So I have sticky notes where I kind of write an ingredient down that I frequently use. And then if I have the sticky note in my journal, I know that I have that ingredient. And once I'm out, I just take it off. That being said, I know a lot of people do spreadsheet tracking. So they'll create a spreadsheet of what they have, when it expires, and when they want to use it by. Some people just have a list that they just write on their fridge. So they'll just have like a little whiteboard, and on it they'll say, okay, these are the things that are in my fridge. And then when they look at that, they can say, oh, okay, I see I have a bag of spinach. That's probably going to go bad soon, so I should use that. So there's lots of different ways. It really depends on the technology that you're comfortable with, how you prefer to organize. In general, I'm a very tactile person, so I like using paper. That being said, if you use Siri often, that's definitely a great way to do it too. Just keep a running list of what you have on your phone. Oh, I like that tip. Um, I know mushrooms can be regrown too, kind of in the same way that I've shown. I haven't personally tried it. So if you have tried regrowing mushrooms in your home from grocery store or from store-bought mushrooms, I would love to hear your experience, just because I eat a lot of mushrooms. So I don't think I have the confidence yet to do that myself. Okay, so thanks everybody for participating and engaging. You guys all had a lot of really thoughtful questions and comments. I do want to say, I said this earlier, but this is not like a catch-all for how to reduce waste in the kitchen. These are things that I personally do. So if there's anything that I missed, there's anything that you do and you want to share with the group, I would love to hear from you. So please reach out to me. You can email us at ssn@ucsd.edu, or you could email me at cindyperez@ucsd.edu. And yeah, if there's no other comments, I think we can move on to our discussion about the story of plastic. So feel free to hang on so we can get that conversation started. If you didn't watch it, but you still want to participate, it's also open to you. So thanks, everyone. I'm
Thank you.
going to turn my camera off now so I can clean up my kitchen.